Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to
U karijeri dugoj 3 decenije radio je kao obavještajac i stručnjak za Istočni Mediteran, a dugo vremena proveo je u Turskoj i Grčkoj. Tečno govori kurdski i turski jezik. Bio je direktor za evropska pitanja u Vijeću za nacionalnu sigurnost Bijele kuće, a potom je radio u State Departmentu kao podsekretar za evropska pitanja. O mogućem ponovnom izboru Donalda Trumpa na mjesto predsjednika SAD-a, naoružavanju Ukrajine, odnosima Washingtona i Ankare, za Al Jazeeru govori Nicholas Kass.
So, Mr. Kass, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans, and thank you so much for taking time to join us. Now, a bit of a general question to start with. How do you see the current state of U.S. national security, given the deepening political divisions at home? And do you think this polarization is affecting how the U.S. handles its foreign policy?
Hello, Harun. It's good to be with you again. Yes, I think it's a very, very important question. I think that clearly the two parties that are now contending for the presidency, the Republicans under former President Donald Trump and the Democrats under current Vice President Kamala Harris, represent two different strains of thinking. And I think with Harris representing the establishmentarian view, the view that has dominated along with the consolidation of the administrative state in the United States, and particularly in the last couple of decades for the 21st century. So I think she represents that strand of thought, the 21st century American unipolar Roman thought, which personally I believe is outdated. And you have a President Trump who is trying to ground things, in my view, in a bit more reality and with a sense of the challenges that are emerging and a commitment or an interest in not getting involved militarily everywhere while being engaged in the world. So yes, I think the implications are significant. And, we'll have to see. It's a very close election. It's being fought in part by the various bread and butter issues of taxes, et cetera, that are traditional. But I think that the real issue transcends this. And it was summed up in a recent statement by President Trump when he was introducing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to his campaign, to support his campaign. And as President Trump said, he said, our opponents support the deep state, or worship the deep state, as he said, and we are trying to obliterate it. And I think that might be a surprise to Western audiences, which have been following the analytical line, so to speak, about coming from the mainstream media in the United States. But the deep state concept is now firmly front and center in the United States for good reason. And I think that is the existential question right now facing us, and from which all the other things are sort of emanating, or at least
right. That was exactly my next question. I mean, you wrote a couple of months ago an article where you talked about the deep state in the U.S. now. And at a rally in April this year, Donald Trump pledged to demolish the deep state. Now, what exactly did he mean by that? And are we talking about a deep state akin to, the deep state that Turkey has had for decades now?
Well, I think that's a very perceptive observation, frankly, and it's one I've been writing about since I retired from government in 2021. The parallel between the Kemalist era deep state, I mean, as you recall, and as your audience in the Balkans and Turkey and elsewhere will recall, the deep state, at least in terms of the naming of the concept, emerged in Turkey as a result of that experience under the dominance of a nominally democratic yet authoritarian and ideologically secularist Kemalist regime,
right?
Controlled Turkish politics for half a century. The parallels, unfortunately, from the perspective of an America which has seen itself as the leading democracy in the world for a long time, the parallels are very pronounced at this point, and we can go into them. But yes, I think that is apt. There is, much to the chagrin of many people, something akin to a deep state in the United States, and we've seen a lot of evidence of that, including most recently, again, reports about involvement of national authorities, federal authorities, in censorship operations that Mr. Zuckerberg from Facebook just, again, illuminated, I think, in greater detail than he had previously, but is fully in keeping with this idea of the media, the oligarchic or corporate media, as we say in the United States, working hand in glove with the censorship apparatus to try to shape the political outcomes in America. Now, I would say that, obviously this is not, the United States is not quite Turkey of the 20th century. Clearly comes from a different tradition, and we do have our democratic tradition to rely on. But I think the thing that's troubling to a lot of people, not only on the conservative side, but I think increasingly on the independent and perhaps old-style liberal side, is the consolidation of this process. And we're not quite at the consolidated power of the deep state, but it's very, very ominous. And I think it's something that bears watching. And I think your audience will, having had similar experiences, perhaps either in Eastern Europe under communism or Turkey or in other places where they're in operations, will have some appreciation for that.
All right. Now, going back to U.S. Foreign policy, I mean, in your view, have domestic political pressures shaped U.S. foreign policy in recent years? And do you think U.S. foreign policy today is more driven by strategic interests or ideology?
Well, I think it's always driven by domestic political considerations. This is a worldwide phenomenon. I think that's probably not too controversial. I think it's also the case that American strategy, such as it is, was non-existent as a consequence of being in a unipolar moment, let's say, for the last, from the 1990s up until relatively recently. Because when you are the superpower, as the French used to say, the hyperpower, and you appear to have unlimited resources to spend at your whim, you don't strategize. Strategy is an art of trying to match ends and means and being very, very clear about what your priorities are. It also is a very, very concrete and small c, non-ideological, conservative thing, because you're trying to conserve your energy, get by with the least you can, and be very, very careful about the things you don't know and don't understand. It has a little bit of, I think what we've in America gotten away from was the idea of having some sort of humility. I know George Bush, when he was running for president before 2000, up to the 2000 election, had mentioned adopting a more humble foreign policy that quickly went to wayside when, the Twin Towers were knocked down by the terrorists, and the neoconservatives who were infiltrating the conservative movement started to dominate the political discourse and the policy discourse in the United States. Interestingly enough, you've seen over the past number of years the neoconservatives gravitating toward the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party is now the party of the establishment, however you want to describe it, deep state, the uniparty, whatever. There are many Republicans, of course, from the old guard that support that, and they support the foreign policy predilections that are involved there. But it's the Trump element which is trying to stand athwart that for all the challenges that it faces. So I think the implications are great. I think we have gotten away from strategy. We need to develop strategy, a more realistic and grounded in reality. And if I may just continue for just a second here, a lot of questions, but my approach has always been that we should first focus on the realities on the ground in particular area that you're looking at before you start to come up with policies and strategies. First, understand the realities. I think we failed to do that in a variety of different places ever since the beginning of the 21st century. We seem to prefer to want to fit those realities into a preconceived notion about how the world should work. And I think we're running to the end of that. That clearly has ended in some respect in terms of the reality. We no longer have that ability to suspend reality, as some people thought in the year 2000 or 2004 was inevitable and something that you could perpetuate. But I don't think the policy apparatus has yet come fully to terms with that. Certainly the political apparatus has not. And so what they are doing, rather, I think, is fighting a rearguard action to preserve their dominance over the system against the challenge that is presented by President Trump. That may result ultimately in the interest of survival in adapting some different political positions. I suspect that the Ukraine war is one of them. I suspect that after the election, with reality staring people in the face, whoever wins, we'll see some change in policy. We know that President Trump wants to change policy. He wants to bring that war to an end. I suspect that Democrats, if they win, free of the electoral constraints or having to pay lip service to the Biden administration in this respect, there will be voices that will be arguing for an end to that. But we'll see. That's speculation.
So in this case, would you agree with Professor Stefan Walt, who a couple of months ago, actually in June, in Foreign Policy, published a piece saying that the problem with President Biden's administration when it comes to foreign policy is simply its incompetence?
Well, I mean, I unfortunately I have to share that, not having read the article, unfortunately, but I do share that general view. I would also say it's not just incompetence; it's also, I think, ideological blinders. I think there is this idea, as President Biden himself used to talk about, the indispensable nature of the United States and the indispensable toward leadership. I think that's a 1990s relic. It's clearly not matched by reality. There's no question the United States is still the superpower, but it needs to start being wiser. These guys, unfortunately, some of them are very, very smart people. So this is not a lack of mental capacity, despite the problem that we all know is associated with the president himself, current president. But it is ideological, and I think the ideology leads people to make decisions or to allow process to take over in lieu of decisions which have been harmful to the United States. And I think we're in a much, much worse strategic position than we were, not only with respect to Ukraine, but certainly with respect also to the Middle East, both of which are distracting from, I think, the real challenge that a superpower like the United States faces, which is to deal with a peer competitor like China. We're not able to do that, and we're actually undermining our ability to do that by the approach that we've taken in the Balkans. I've been saying that, or in Ukraine, I've been saying this since before the war started. This also has put a lot of pressure, I think, on the NATO apparatus. The focus on NATO should always be about defense of the actually existing membership,
and not expansion.
The actually existing members, the real members of NATO. The focus should be on their defense. It should not have been on out of area operations, either in the Balkans, frankly, where it's, or certainly in Ukraine, where we're seeing the negative effect of that. As a result, I think we're bringing the war closer to home, and we're creating a lot of angst and tension within NATO that we really didn't have to have. So we're undermining our own case there. If people are interested in the survivability of NATO, then the focus should be on a more conservative and I'd say defense-focused, focus on the actually existing members. Don't try to change the world with NATO.
Right. We'll speak a bit about NATO in a minute, but since you mentioned the Balkans, I mean, there have been quite a number of high-profile U.S. and NATO visits to the Balkans recently, particularly to Bosnia and Herzegovina. We've seen CIA Director William Burns. He was here just 10 days ago. In your view, can Moscow utilize its proxies in the Balkans to stir havoc and get NATO busy extinguishing flames within its own inner yard, given that Bosnia and Kosovo border quite a number of NATO member states?
Well, of course. I mean, I think it's not only in the Balkans, the Western Balkans, but also in Central and East Europe generally. I mean, again, we're still coming out of a period which was where there was a lot of Soviet influence.
Right.
And those mechanisms still sort of exist, those kind of networks, shall we say, although in many cases they've been overwhelmed by the pro-Western orientation of a lot of these countries. Nevertheless, there are still avenues. But I think of it also not so much as a reflection of Russian penetration or Russian influence. I think people have to be really, really careful about that. They have to look at the realities of these situations and understand why it is that these societies may or may not be enamored of Western policy or Western interests. I mean, in a lot of places, there's a lot of concern, for example, that the EU treats the newly arrived members as second-class citizens. I hear that a lot from where I am, and it's not unplausible to say that. I think you also have just a general concern in these regions, which tend to be, let's say, more conservative, about some of the rather radical social policies that are emanating out of the West in ways that I think promote instability and strife. And I think those are fertile ground for people to make hay out of, to extend their influence in combating. But I want to emphasize that it's not a question of but for Russian influence or but for Russian penetration we're having these problems. I think that's a rather juvenile way to look at foreign policy. And again, I would invite people to look more closely at realities on the ground and then be able to discern what wise policy is. And I think we've been getting away from that. We've been looking for excuses, whether we're blaming disinformation in the United States and all these other things that we talk about as a way to explain the rise of Donald Trump, let's say, to prominence or something like that. It's all a result of clever manipulation. I think sometimes that's projection, and something that is an old tried and true deep state tactic, by the way.
Right. Now, President Trump, speaking of NATO, he has at quite a number of occasions called for an equitable share of defense spending. Now, given these recent disagreements between the U.S. and its European allies on these issues concerning defense spending, do you see them as being serious cracks and fissures within the transatlantic alliance?
Well, I mean, I think that there's, for reasons that I think predate President Trump, there's been some talk, at least in some of the Western NATO countries, about adopting an independent foreign policy or increasingly independent foreign policy. That's certainly been something coming from France. I mean, these are pre-existing ideas. I don't speak for President Trump, so I can't, I'm just an analyst out here, but it does seem to me that that what he is reflecting is a real sense in America that is probably going to be adopted on both sides because it makes sense, which is that while as important as Europe is and as engaged as the United States will stay in Europe, that on a matter of defense, this has to become more equitable. Now, we've seen a lot of countries get beyond, or some countries get beyond the 2% threshold of GDP spending, I think it was, that was originally established as sufficient. I suspect that under the circumstances, we are going to see calls for more. And if indeed people are talking about, this as a critical issue, they will respond. I know it does put a lot of pressure on domestic social welfare spending in Europe, and that has been important to addressing social stability, et cetera. And that's an understandable concern. But, national defense it has to be a priority. And it's very self-evident about why this would have to be the case. So, yeah, I think once the election is over, if the Republicans win, you'll definitely see President Trump, I suspect, pursuing that line. If the Democrats win, I suspect more quietly, you'll continue to see pressure for them to take on more of the burden.
Now let's move on to Turkey. I know you have spent quite a lot of time in Turkey. How would you describe the current state of relations between the United States and Turkey, especially with Turkey trying to balance its NATO commitments and its trade ties with Russia and its support for Ukraine?
Well, I think we've seen over the last 20 years, in particular with the rise of the AKP, we've seen a Turkey that has emerged from what was essentially a basket case in many respects, economically and socially unstable, dominated by a military apparatus that was staging coups left and right and intimidating politicians on a moment's notice. We've seen them rise, consolidate, and grow economically such that they can start promoting their own interests and view of the world. Those interests and views are sometimes going to conflict with what American policy has been. There's no question about that. And it's not to say that Turkey, by the way, doesn't have any severe challenges in terms of domestic political development and its economic policy. I mean, I think this is clear. But if we're talking about it in terms of foreign policy, we're going to see a Turkey that obviously sees itself correctly as heir of a different civilizational trend, has tried to integrate with the EU and has had limited success, shall we say, has been a member of NATO, but has seen the principal NATO country adopting policies on Turkey's border, which unfortunately from the Turkish perspective are threatening stability, not only in the region and on Turkey. And I've written, we talked about that last time, of course. So we'll be compelled by nature of its geography and its circumstances and its historical background to continue to pursue a course that is marked by, at least theoretically or conceptually, a pursuit of Turkish interests as opposed to a subordination of them to the wisdom of the United States or other Western countries. There are some countries in the world that continue to do that, who rely on the United States to provide the strategic context, I think, for a variety of things that are going on. I think some of that is starting to wear a little bit thin, given the lack of success we've had in some key endeavors. And what that is doing is, of course, opening up people to the possibility of other approaches and other influences, which, from the perspective of the United States, is not too welcome. I would add personally that I think that in many cases, in most cases, particularly in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, the future still requires a good, strong relationship with the United States, and it's in part a contingent on Washington to make some adjustments, just as we are assisting that Europe pay its fair share into the defense of NATO, shall we say. We should be also a little bit more aware of the problems that have been created on the energy front and everywhere else with respect to some of the things that we're doing. So I think that transatlantic tie is very, very important, but it needs to be revamped. I think, frankly, we need to see a little bit more of a consensual kind of view coming out of Washington. And I think we're going to get there eventually, but it's
right.
going to...
But does the U.S. understand that Ankara has its own legitimate security concerns, which may not always be aligned with that of Washington, and that arming, an offshoot of the PKK, which has been at war with Ankara for 40 years, is really not the best way to maintain a relationship with a fellow NATO ally?
Well, I think some people grasp that. I think the problem is that there's a difference between grasping that conceptually and then imposing on the state apparatus in the United States the sort of clarity that would require a change. As you know, I wrote about this, and President Trump changed this a couple of times and was stymied by a variety of factors, including some insubordination and outright falsehoods on the parts of bureaucrats. There were some political challenges as well. He was facing an impeachment and was vulnerable, I think, to, shall we say, neoconservative elements within his own party had he pursued his desire to pull out of Syria, for example. So it's once the policy is set, inertia takes hold, and it's very, very difficult to shake that. But as a conceptual matter, I think the more people understand, there are a few people, let's say, again, who understand this. I tried to outline that in some detail, what I thought the problems were in this respect. One of them is that if you're going to be fighting ISIS, it's probably not the best way to do it by engaging with elements of a Marxist-rooted secularist terrorist organization that doesn't seem to be flying. It flies in the face of not only ISIS, shall we say, but also normal people's predilection. Seeing a result of that as well. So again, I think it's going to require a top to bottom shakeout of the bureaucratic process in the United States, and we'll see whether that happens. It's a very daunting task. We know what happened in the context of President Trump's efforts to challenge the deep state during his tour. We saw the hoaxes being brought to bear. We saw the investigations, the pointless investigations, the deliberate misconstruing of telephone calls, et cetera, that led to impeachments. We've seen the lawfare that was designed to keep him out of office, and which was very, again, reminiscent of what's known in Turkey as the 28 Şubat period, the deep state postmodern coup, where not only did they kick out the then Refah-led government, but they also tried to ban, and did ban, not only Mr. Erdogan and others, but kept Necmettin Erbakan, the prime minister, basically out of
back in 1997.
Yeah, and so you're seeing it's inescapable when you look at and compare. You're seeing a lot of the same steps being done, and a lot of that is done because of the perception that Trump represented a challenge to the way things are going, to the establishment. And expect even after the election, if he wins, we're going to see some of that too. So it's getting a
Right.
very interesting time for America.
Right. Mr. Nicholas Kass, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you very much, Harun. Always a pleasure.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?